You're listening to Health is Membership, brought to you by MCAM Architecture and Design. My name's Zach Benedict. I'm an architect working in Northeast Indiana, and I'm sitting down with innovators across the care continuum to examine how we can redefine a culture of health throughout the Midwest. Here we will talk with physicians, economists, urbanists, politicians, poets, and everyone in between to highlight the specific problems facing our communities and consider the most effective ways to ensure their sustainability in the coming years. We are in this together, and we will need each other if we sincerely want to change the trajectory of our communities and work to improve the quality of life for people of all ages and abilities. This show is intended to help cultivate that discussion and remind us that health isn't a metric, it's a membership, one that requires each of us to play a part.
There are people all over the country that focus on neighborhood redevelopment, but none seem to be as empathetic about it as Andrew Hoffman. Throughout his career, he has worked with communities from Northeast Indiana to East Africa, searching for effective strategies that can empower places to, in some way, control their own quality of life. The answer isn't necessarily charity, it's commerce, a systematic investment within struggling neighborhoods that embraces a model focused on gentrification for justice. The trick with this strategy is clearly identifying who determines what constitutes justice. And once you talk with Andrew, the answer to that question is very clear. The leadership must be provided at the local level. The challenge is making sure that it does. And no one understands that better than him, which is precisely why we invited him to the show. Really excited to talk to you a little bit. Over the years, we've talked a lot about neighborhood development, and I thought it would be an interesting time just to talk a little bit about what sustainable neighborhood development really looks like, feels like, and really, in some ways, maybe pick your brain. I know you're doing work, that you did here in Northeast Indiana, but it's a career that expands working for underserved communities here in the Midwest all the way to East Africa. So I guess maybe one of the first things I wanted to start talking about is, in all your work with neighborhoods, what are some of the common themes that you describe to people when they're thinking about how to improve a neighborhood?
Yeah, that question really, for me, has to begin with who's asking the question, and that's critical in understanding where to go from that path. There's this part where it's often asked from those outside of the neighborhood, how do we begin to transform this? How do we begin helping neighbors be more connected? How do we begin addressing any number of social issues? Always coming from good intentions, from typical intentions of wanting to help. Sometimes it's coming from a position of how do we capitalize, how do we expand our business or our decision making, and in many cases, from my angle, it's many organizations attempting to serve some sort of social issue, kind of trying to take ground in some ways. And taking ground might be too harsh of a word, but they are looking to how do we serve, how do we expand, how do we have a position in these communities. And so when the question's asked from an outside perspective, it becomes far more nuanced and typically asking a lot of questions of what's your intention and what is your hope, and do you know anyone in this neighborhood, and how do you know that your solution is even the right solution or a desired solution for the community? Just because there might be a statistic or a string of news events that illustrate the connectivity to your desire in that community to help doesn't necessarily mean that's where the flip side would begin. Now, if it's a group of neighbors asking, how do we improve our neighborhood? Here are the issues that we see and are trying to address, but we don't even know how to begin. This is our lived and our felt experience every day. Here's what we think the solution is, but how would we begin addressing that? And that is a more fun conversation to have in many ways, because it's initiated with a group of people that are determined to figure it out and to improve their lived experience. And as an outsider, being invited into those conversations, the best thing I can do is just help them begin to document and to begin thinking through the implications and why, asking a lot of why questions and what questions, to try to both understand the issue, but also evaluate what sort of assets or resources the community already has and what would maybe be needed from outside. So
what role does, for lack of a better term, what role does localism play in this? A lot of times these conversations are held with people outside the intimate group, the neighborhood, but rarely do I think you are in a situation where the neighborhood has identified what they need and just want to figure out how to get there. Usually it's a little bit more nuanced and open-ended than that, but there seems to be this constant battle, and I think you do this better than most, of trying to empathize with the actual issues at the local level without thinking that simply because something worked in a different community, it should work here.
Well, it comes down to ownership. And what do you get to actually control? When you think of outside organizations, the belief that you get to control and influence a community is often misguided and misunderstood. You have a set of resources or a particular solution that you are very much in control of, and you might be able to go into a community and implement with or without any sort of help and get some sort of return on that. And that's part of it. But long-term transformation and long-term change in a community is only driven by those that can take ownership of the change they want to see in their own life, in their own neighborhood, and their willingness to extend beyond themselves for the sake of their neighbor. And I think that's a really important thing, because no one gets to control anyone. Zach, I don't get to control. I don't get to make decisions for you. You don't get to make decisions for me. And when you put that in a proximate location, and you take a group of neighbors and say a vulnerable neighborhood or a target particular area, and you bring all of them to the table, they're first and foremost trying to protect themselves and their own assets and their families, the things that matter the most to them. They are in deep protection mode, which is a very self-focused mode. What you hope to do as a community, activist kind of person is trying to figure out what is everyone trying to protect, and is there enough similarities or enough connective points that you can begin saying, oh, this is really good, you need to be protecting this. How do we protect everyone in this way? How do we get aligned on the thing that's most urgent to us? And that looks completely different for every group of neighbors. Some might be safety, some might be beautification, but it's typically a felt need. And my job and my goal and what I've learned over the years is I got to first align people to where they're most protecting the things that are important to them as a whole. What are those things? What are those things that I can build some collective energy? And then getting them to move forward towards that collective energy in some fashion that allows them to have some successful shared wins, because that builds trust among themselves. And only until then do you get to really influence that group of individuals towards maybe something else that isn't quite on the radar. And you're really just having to connect a lot of slow dots that, safety and security is connected to this, quality of place. And you know what? Yes, we can install some more lights, we can call some more police, but you know what? Our alleys need a beautification initiative, or we need X, Y, and Z in order to get to where we're not having to fight it at the day-to-day level.
There's this phrase, toxic charity, that sometimes I think begs the question, how often do good intentions get in the way of sustainable progress, like neighborhood development? How often do people that I think have the assumption that things are broken and they're there to fix it? And whether or not there is a sincere altruistic intent there, you've seen, we both have seen where that has caused more problems than it probably offered solutions. Where is that line between good intentions and sustainable results?
Comes down to ownership of the improvements and the desired improvements. So often, the toxic charity really comes from a place of a group of outsiders, and even, it could be a group of insiders depending on the neighborhood, but it's a group of people that have come together with a desire to help and to serve and to redistribute any number of resources on behalf of others that physically and probably visibly is needed. Yet it undercuts a group of individuals' ability to solve their own problem. And when it becomes toxic is in, if I'm coming with my group to do X, Y, and Z, and I've not been invited, I've brought too much, I've not listened to neighbors, I've not stopped at the right appropriate place, and I push on with good intentions. And most of the time, from my experience over the years, the last 20 years doing this kind of work, it's when the group of good intentioned individuals just aren't listening and they're not stopping, when they're not paying attention, they're not observing the body languages, the requests, I don't want my bushes trimmed, thanks but no thanks, but they need it, and anyone can physically look like that these bushes need trimmed, and the person trying to do good not respecting the reality that these bushes need trim. True, you have the ability to trim them, but you're being asked not to, and being able to walk away. It's in those moments, big and small, is when that really begins to cause problems down the road.
You see that being a common human trait, or is that different in the Midwest than it would be in a third world setting? How do you navigate that? How much common theme is there to that instinct, that human instinct to only want help that I've permitted you to offer?
I think it's a human instinct, and it spreads as far and wide as anything. And I think you could even, to get real macro on a global perspective, having tracked with and now worked in emerging and frontier market kind of countries, real poverty stricken $1.90 a day kind of places, and billions and billions and billions of dollars of aid and charity have been poured into these communities. And you could make a really strong case as none of it has helped. It has not transformed these communities like those with the good intentions and the givers of such charity desired. And if we don't ask questions about why that is, or if we don't really listen to the answers when we do ask the questions, then we're just going to keep pushing. And most of the time, charity and service is far more about the people giving it than it is about what they're trying to help. Because most times you would have these kind of questions you're asking is like, why are we doing this? This isn't what's being invited. Yeah, but this is needed. This is what's good. This is what I want to do with the resources I have. And no one's going to say no. Like, and oftentimes we're not loud enough. Like, it's this idea, kind of would always try to do this. Like, Zach, if we're just together and I give you $20, I could just, here's a $20 bill. Are you going to really say no? You might say, oh, yeah, thanks. I don't really need this. But if I keep persisting and saying, no, Zach, here, it's just $20 bill. Eventually we're going to get to the place where you're like, sure, I'll take it. Fine. I'll put it in my pocket. I'm going to go. And that happens in this discussion. And we're not really like wondering why we're trying to force $20 into somebody else's hand. And it's common when you don't have resources to want more resources. Like, we all do that. Like, that's a human instinct. And therefore, if the systems are not as personal as me interacting with you directly and offering you a $20 bill, and we zoom out through through charitable directions or social services, and we're putting money into these charitable mechanisms, then it creates a disconnection of humanity. And no wonder, at times, like if you want to come in and put $100,000 park in my corner of this neighborhood, who's going to tell you no about that? No neighborhood is going to tell you no. But when you come back in 1 year, 2 years, and you wonder why the park's destroyed, or it's not being maintained, or there's weeds, or there's problems in that park, and you're wondering as a giver, gosh, I just did this for this neighborhood and it's not being respected or desired. You said you wanted this, and then you might have to think real critically and say, did they ask for it? Is that part of their vision? Or did you just offer them $100,000, and who's going to turn that down?
Is there a way or a tell in your mind when you walk into a situation where you're evaluating the current state of a neighborhood and its and the people trying to help it, if there is a level of toxicity? Like, is there a situation where you walk in and you go, oh, this is really upside down right now, and I can tell because of X, Y, or Z? Or is it not ever that obvious?
Well, when you walk into those kind of situations in a more professional realm, and NeighborLink always kind of took the approach of we didn't have the solutions. We just had a bunch of people that wanted to help. And almost every time we were invited there because neighbors are inviting us to come help them. So there was always an invitation. But as I progressed in relationships with those neighbors, from transactions to a little bit zoomed out, or I'm trying to build relationships with the neighborhood association, the tells that I would receive of whether this was a neighborhood that was progressing was the attitudes and kind of the edge in which the leadership received or was skeptical of what the organization was doing. And within 15, 20 minutes, you could really pick up on whether or not this group of individuals had been burned by a number of good intentioned individuals for a long time. And sometimes as city government, and the desire and the promise the city government's supposed to help your neighborhood in any number of ways, and not fully understanding the limitations of what city government is, but that's still causing this frustration, this deep frustration of like, I keep calling, and I get nothing. But I also don't know how to do anything about this as a collection of neighbors. And specifically in neighborhoods that have had some attention to them, that meaning that there's been developments happening, or people have been asking lots of questions from different angles, gathering research, making promises that they might have a solution, and then never executing. And so you can see a handful of those neighborhoods, and it's really driven by like, what is their attitude towards outside help, and how often have they been burned or left without anything after committing to discussions with outside individuals desiring to help.
I've been haunted by this interview I heard on NPR a couple months ago with Daniel Kahneman, the psychologist.
Yeah.
And the interviewer asks him, he said, if you had your choice, what would you rather do, increase happiness or reduce misery? And I thought, man, that's a really good question. But within a second, he responded, reduce misery 100% of the time. And it happened so quickly, it was clear, he had thought about this, but he goes on to say, if your whole goal is to make people happy, what you'll find is you make happy people marginally happier, and you do very little to make unhappy people happy. But it feels good, right? This idea that you get up in the morning and your purpose is happiness, versus the exhausting admission that you wake up every morning and try to reduce misery to some extent, which doesn't have the same feel to it. And I thought that's one way to phrase this idea of toxic charity is, what are you really trying to do here? What's the metric of success? Is it just try to make everyone happy because I feel good about the happiness side of it? Or am I really here to make a difference? And if so, I think that's a very different approach and sentiment. And I immediately thought of, your work and some of the things you do, and that there's a fine line between admitting that you're here to in some way help reduce misery, it's even more complicated to say, my job here is to help you reduce your own misery. You tell me what it is. And I'm here to listen and I'm here to help.
So we did, a few years back, we did this study on what makes healthy neighborhoods healthy. And we interviewed 5 Fort Wayne neighborhoods, and pretty exhaustive over the course of the year, and brought some resources alongside each one of them. But it was really fueled by this desire to understand the public narrative, like the narrative. I would go into particular areas and work with neighborhoods, and everybody loved it and thought it was a healthy neighborhood. And so I wanted to see why, what makes this neighborhood healthy. And then I would go into the other neighborhoods, because I had worked for so many years in all different kinds of neighborhoods, and what was the public perception and the narrative and the conversation was often different than what I was experiencing practically on the ground with neighbors. But the real research ended with kind of 5 key characteristics of what makes a healthy neighborhood healthy. And they all kind of revolved around really baseline, basic improvements and quality of life related kind of things, like safety and security, beautification, social connectivity, healthy relationships. And when you break it down into each one of those communities, and you wonder what the practical things that they would want improvements on, because you're always kind of asking those kind of questions, like, okay, what does beautification really mean to you? Like, what would improvement in that be? You know what? It's cleaner streets, cleaner alleys. I want people to I want to be able to solve the issues that no one has responsibility for. And frankly, like, there's just a ton of trash on our streets. That's a misery related issue. That isn't a happiness thing. I'm not happier if I see, I'm just less miserable because I'm tired of looking at it. That gets deep to my soul every time. Like, it makes me feel bad. It makes me feel bad in my own neighborhood. There's judgment in that. Like, if it was gone, I don't necessarily feel exponentially more happy. I'm not on that level. It's just feel less bad. Now that that's gone, maybe I can work on something else. And there's all kinds of illustrations around that. But those are the kind of things that what neighborhoods at the baseline want help with, especially those that aren't organized or don't have, community development initiatives, or, haven't been at it for a dozen years on figuring out how to use the resources they have to improve things at a systemic level. Gosh, they just want help with the things that nobody else is willing to do. They don't care about the housing stock that much. They do, but they don't look at it from a statistical perspective. They're looking at it as, this is what I'm living, and I like living here, but I don't like how I can't control the things that are affecting me every day.
I think it makes it changes the tone of the work and who it attracts, right, to help.
Yeah, because no one outside wants to do that.
Right.
Like, no one wants to fund that. The city isn't going to come and send 25 trash pickers every day. They're not going to pay for that. No nonprofit. If you come back from the research and you put that in front of any sort of foundation or any sort of philanthropist, we're going to fund people to go pick up trash. Versus say, I'm going to go repair, 100 roofs in this neighborhood. That's not going to get picked up. That's where the charity aspect, because it's at my level, like, I'm the giver. That's not what I want to fund. Well, so there's this disconnect between, what do you really want to help neighbors with what they need help with in order to build trust and move them on a journey? Or are you really just interested in the thing that also makes you feel good? And I'm not saying that that's bad. It's your resources. You get to make a determination. But in that tension and that disconnect is where things often kind of get challenging.
Well, that's why I thought the question was so interesting, because it boils it down to really just the essence of the question, this idea of altruism and selflessness is sometimes misleading. There is something in it for a lot of these people that do this kind of work. But the question is, do you get up in the morning because you want to make people happy, or are you trying to make a difference on their terms? And if so, you'd be spending a lot more time talking about the reduction of misery, I think, than necessarily just getting grants that are readily available to pretend like we're making people happier.
The only way that I've seen to make progress in that is in a concept of just relocation and redistribution. Only until members with resources, only until individuals with resources or those in the solutions move towards the problem, like physically, to the point that it becomes your problem. It's not anybody else's problem. You are now in the midst of a dirty neighborhood and you're trying to live out. It is now a shared experience. Until you can move closer towards a practical, lived, shared experience to the extent that it is possible, given but until you physically live and move yourself or move your organization or move your business into that area to where you now have a shared experience, because these are no longer people across town or those, that I'm trying to help. They are now my neighbors, and this is now my street, and now this is impacting my block and my family or whatever it is. Until we get more things moving, you can't begin to, because you're going to solve the problem, because it's now your problem, and you're going to use your resources, your education, your network, to solve that problem in a fresh and completely different way.
In some ways, like a forced empathy.
Yeah,
right?
it's your problem now. This is
Right.
your human. You're going to reduce your own misery.
You've mentioned before that for real change, especially in these types of settings, is going to have to come from market-based solutions. The idea of commerce as part of the equation. How does that play into some of these discussions of maybe not even relocation, but how we rethink asset allocation and what commerce really means at the local level, especially in distressed neighborhoods?
Yeah, so getting into the real community development mindset, and how do you, it's one thing to be grassroots and trying to connect people to kind of go bottom up, but how do you really come alongside and be a part of that from an institutional perspective? And I really, really believe, as you mentioned, that the market-based solutions economy, because everyone's a consumer every day. Each one of us, if we're all responsible for our own choices, we're all making choices every day. How we use our time, how do we love others, how do we utilize the resources that we have, and the way people are going to progress through that life is going to be creating greater opportunities. And I think healthy neighborhoods are those that are working towards a diversification, a socioeconomic diversification. And I think diverse neighborhoods are healthy. I think they are required for human flourishing. Any really low income neighborhood, if you look at this from a statistical perspective, if the median household income is $27,000, that plays a huge influence on whether or not that neighborhood will ever develop and ever have the opportunities for those neighbors that are making up that classification. Is by diversifying, and it's going to be by inviting resources into the neighborhood, not by trying to raise the ocean for all ships in that place. There has to be an influx of resource. There has to be business. There has to be commerce. There has to be better jobs. Like, if you want individuals to have greater opportunities, we need to pay them well, and we need to train them for those jobs, and those jobs need to be accessible. And if those things are happening, then the business is going to come in and they're going to invest, and they're going to build a new $20 million, building in that area that's going to bring up, property prices, which is important, even though that brings controversy. But there has to be things that are attracting individuals to that area. And even better is if it creates opportunities to invite those that have gotten up and out, those neighbors who have gotten the education and got out, is inviting them back and giving them opportunities to return to the place that they grew up and they know, and they could raise their families there. That's important because we want to bring indigenous, local individuals back to a community that they already know, and they're bringing their education and their resources to bear and their shared experiences back in order to raise, the opportunities and create new opportunities for everybody else. I just don't know that. I mean, charity charity has its limitations. Like there will always be a limited amount of money in the charitable efforts. There will only ever be limited amounts of time. Like even in our experience, like I can get people to mow grass and paint houses all day long, but I can't get them to completely renovate 100 homes in a neighborhood. It
Now,
just isn't going to happen.
what you'll get is the rebuttal that what you're talking about is gentrification,
Yeah.
which comes with this horrible connotation and this negative, I think, reaction by many. How do you position that in more of a positive and maybe even just way?
Yeah, I hear when I hear about gentrification, and gentrification is so much about ownership and it's so much about the land and the physical assets. And when that is what I learn is many of the individuals in these neighborhoods that have influence and have a voice and are working towards something, they are working towards gentrification oriented decisions and projects. They want to see businesses grow. They want to see entrepreneurs, thrive. They want to see resources come to their neighborhood. They want people to have better houses. But under the context of them having greater ownership in the process, whether being the catalyst to make it happen, or they get to own the properties, or they get to start the businesses, or they're getting to invite the right kind of businesses that bring the kind of jobs and property values up. When they're on the right side of ownership of either the ideas or the projects, they desire gentrification. They may not call it gentrification, but the functional aspects of what gentrification represents, therefore. So this becomes an issue of who's in charge and who's at the ownership table. Well, in many low-income neighborhoods, until the magic happens and more and more people return back with their resources to lead the initiative in charge, there's going to be outside forces. And I think that there needs to be greater mediaries between those with local ownership and knowledge and those outside partners who have the resources that are going to bring. And I think in those moments is where gentrification with justice happens, is that there's a collection of activities, there's a collection of people developing the community development plan and the strategies for their communities. And they are controlling, in a way, they're casting the vision, developing the plans in a way that it invites the right kind of partners and keeps out the wrong partners, that they are in leadership far enough that for the most part, they are inviting good development and they're keeping out bad development. And that gets to the justice point, is in that circle. And what does that looks different for every neighborhood. It could be, if rental prices keep going up and up and up, what does it look like for somebody to create a really equitable, just rental company? It's to say people need rent to rent. There's nothing wrong with an entrepreneur or a property development person to have 100 homes in a neighborhood. Now, if that person can develop that 100 home rental community and can blend market-based solutions, it's got to make money, it's got to be, a home's got to get improved, opportunities. But if they can figure out, like, hey, we're going to focus on energy efficient updates for these homes because we want to put more money back into the pockets of our renters every month. Might be small, but we're going to focus on that kind of thing. And you know what? We're going to partner with philanthropy, the foundations of the world, who say, we're renting to individuals that are having a harder time in life than some, and we're going to build social services as part of our rental company. We don't make enough profit to really generate and do that on our own, but how can we create partnerships with social service organizations, foundations, and saying, look, we're creating really safe, affordable housing for 100 individuals in this particular area with these statistics. And you know what? We need another $75,000 a year to provide a couple of social workers to be able to check in on them and make sure that they have access or mental health capacity. Something that allows, that to solve that problem through a market-based solution is just kind of a general example.
Gentrification is the assumption that we're introducing diversity. The trick is to make sure it stays diverse. And I think that's where the justice comes from.
Land banking is another great example.
Right.
Like, the challenge in these neighborhoods is somebody from outside comes in and buys all the land. And it cuts any opportunity, any future opportunities for a long period of time. of local people buying land, building homes, creating those businesses. Because if I own the land, then I get to control the development. And if we're allowing that to happen from outside, then it creates real predatory issues. Gentrification with justice is saying this land needs developed. This is a good thing. We need to create opportunities, but we need to own the land in order for it to be successful. And we need to set aside 40% of the land for always affordable housing through a land bank, a land trust.
Thank you for taking the time today.
Yeah, Zach.
It's always a pleasure. I adore the work you do, and I'd love to just sit down and talk about what this means and how it can actually be measurable and effective moving to the future, because these are complicated ideas if you give them enough time and attention. So from us to you, thank you for all the work you do. Thank you for taking the time, and we'll do this again soon.
You're welcome. Thanks for always asking the right kind of questions and allowing me to join in the learning. It's all
Talk soon, okay?
All right, Zach.
All right, take care.
Okay.